Somewhere within the ancient stone walls of Hogwarts, a door exists only in the precise moment you need it most, and vanishes the instant you wonder if it was ever there at all. You find yourself drawn tonight to this mystery, this architectural impossibility that has puzzled wizards for 1,000 years and readers for nearly 3 decades. And honestly, if you have ever desperately searched for a bathroom in an unfamiliar building, you already understand the fundamental appeal of a room that appears exactly when you need it. The Room of Requirement, known by some as the Come-and-Go Room, represents perhaps the most fascinating magical space in all of wizarding literature, and you are about to explore every hidden corner of its impossible geometry. Much like the great hall builders of medieval Europe who constructed secret priest holes into manor houses during the English recusancy of the 1500s and 1600s to hide Catholic clergy from persecution, the ancient architects of Hogwarts understood that true safety sometimes requires invisibility. You settle deeper into your pillow now, and I should mention that lying horizontal while learning about magical rooms is approximately 47% more effective than reading while sitting upright, a statistic I have entirely fabricated, but which feels emotionally accurate. The Room of Requirement exists in that liminal space between need and manifestation, between thought and physical reality, and scholars who study the intersection of magical theory and architectural enchantment remain divided on whether the room generates its contents ex nihilo or simply retrieves them from some vast interdimensional warehouse, which would honestly explain where IKEA gets all their furniture too. You breathe slowly now, feeling the day's tensions beginning to dissolve like morning mist on the Black Lake, and there is a quirky historical footnote worth mentioning. Certain Victorian seance parlors featured concealed mechanical systems that could alter room configurations mid-session, complete with hidden panels and sliding bookcases, proving that the desire for rooms that transform according to need predates Hogwarts in the Muggle imagination. The Room of Requirement awaits, patient as it has been for a millennium, ready to reveal its secrets to you in this quiet hour, and you feel the anticipation building like the gentle hum of magic preparing to manifest something wonderful. You continue down this path of discovery, and the founders of Hogwarts begin to take shape in your imagination. 4 powerful witches and wizards whose vision for magical education included a room that could become anything any person within these walls might require. The concept itself is almost aggressively generous, which makes you wonder if the founders were perhaps slightly naive about human nature, because if you gave the average person a room that manifested their deepest needs, at least 30% of those rooms would immediately fill with snacks. Scholars continue to debate whether the Room of Requirement was enchanted by all 4 founders working in concert, or whether it represents the singular genius of one, most commonly credited to Rowena Ravenclaw, whose legendary wisdom might have extended to architectural enchantment. You find it fitting that this mystery echoes the real historical uncertainty surrounding collaborative medieval construction projects, such as the building of Notre Dame de Paris, which began in 1163 and involved so many architects and craftsmen over nearly 2 centuries that attributing specific innovations to individual minds becomes nearly impossible. The torchlight flickers against the 7th floor corridor stones in your imagination, and you notice how the shadows seem to breathe with the castle's own ancient rhythm. Here is a peculiar historical note that might make you smile. During the Renaissance, Italian architects experimented with so-called memory palaces, physical spaces designed to enhance recollection, and some eccentric nobles allegedly constructed entire rooms that could be rearranged by servants overnight to test their guests' mental acuity. Essentially, very expensive, very confusing pranks. You wrap your blanket a little tighter, and I should mention that blankets are essentially portable comfort rooms, which makes them the Muggle equivalent of carrying the Room of Requirement with you at all times. Less impressive magically, but considerably more accessible. The 7th floor corridor stretches before you now in your mind's eye, tapestries depicting the foolish attempt of Barnabas the Barmy to train trolls for the ballet swaying gently in a draft that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and you prepare yourself for the ritual that will reveal the door. You stand now before the blank stretch of wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, and the sheer mundane ordinariness of the stone before you seems almost insulting given what you know lies hidden within it, like meeting a celebrity and discovering they have absolutely no idea how to parallel park. The ritual to summon the Room of Requirement is elegantly simple, yet psychologically demanding. You must walk past this wall 3 times while concentrating intensely on what you need, and the room will manifest accordingly. This process seems almost whimsically bureaucratic for such powerful magic, as though the castle requires you to fill out an internal request form using only your footsteps and desperate intentions. The number 3 holds particular significance across magical traditions and historical practices, and you find yourself recalling the very real medieval belief in the power of trebling. Pilgrims in the Middle Ages would often circle sacred sites 3 times before entering, a practice called circumambulation that appears in traditions from Celtic Christianity to ancient Greek temple worship to Buddhist stupas across Asia. You breathe slowly as you begin your imaginary first pass along the corridor, and the stones beneath your feet, in your mind's eye, feel smooth and cool, worn by centuries of students who have walked this path for countless different needs. The process requires what scholars of magical theory describe as intentional focus, and there remains an open debate among academics about whether the room responds to conscious surface needs or to deeper subconscious desires, which would make the Room of Requirement either extremely helpful or potentially very embarrassing, depending on how well you know yourself. Your second pass begins, and you notice the tapestry seems to shimmer slightly. Barnabas the Barmy's expression perhaps a touch more sympathetic than it was a moment ago, as if he understands better than most what it means to attempt something everyone else considers impossible. There is a curious historical parallel to this walking ritual in the ancient Roman practice of lustration, wherein priests would walk prescribed circuits around fields or armies to purify and protect them, suggesting that the founders of Hogwarts may have drawn upon very old magical traditions indeed, perhaps older than recorded wizarding history. You wonder, as you continue your imagined second pass, how many students have walked this corridor in the depths of night, desperately needing something the castle could provide. A place to hide, a place to practice, a place to simply be alone with thoughts too heavy to carry in crowded common rooms. The third pass begins now, and you feel the magic beginning to stir, like the deep vibration of a great bell about to ring. Here is a peculiar and somewhat fringe historical tidbit that academic historians generally dismiss, but which makes for excellent bedtime contemplation. Some medieval alchemical texts reference the construction of philosophers' chambers, sealed rooms allegedly designed to transform not lead into gold, but rather to transform the alchemist's consciousness itself. And certain eccentric scholars have suggested these texts might describe genuine magical architecture that has since been lost or hidden. You smile at this notion as your third pass completes, and before you, where moments ago there was only ancient stone, a door begins to appear, not suddenly, but with the organic slowness of a flower opening. The wood grain becoming visible first, then the iron hinges, then the handle, warm brass that catches torchlight as if it has been waiting here for you specifically, for this exact moment in time. The corridor is otherwise silent except for the distant sound of wind against the high windows, and perhaps the faint snoring of Barnabas the Barmy's trolls in their eternal tapestry failure. You realize, standing here, that the ritual of 3 passes serves a purpose beyond mere magical mechanics. It gives you time to clarify your intentions, to refine your need from a vague longing into something specific enough for the castle to understand and provide. The door before you now represents the culmination of 1,000 years of accumulated magical architecture, the collaborative genius of founders whose names you know well, and castle elves whose names you will never learn, and you feel appropriately humbled by the sheer scope of enchantment that has gone into creating this single, perfect doorway. I should mention, in a gently humorous aside, that if the Room of Requirement existed in the Muggle world, the line of people waiting to walk past the blank wall would stretch approximately from London to Edinburgh. and the rooms manifested would be roughly 70% quiet places to nap and 30% spaces where my phone has infinite battery. But here in this imagined corridor, there is no line, no crowd, just you and the door and the weight of 1,000 years of magic waiting patiently to be explored. You reach for the handle. The door swings open, and you step into what you recognize immediately as the Room of Hidden Things, that vast cathedral of discarded secrets where generations of Hogwarts inhabitants have stashed objects they wish to lose, forget, or preserve away from prying eyes. The sheer scale of the space before you defies the logical constraints of the castle's architecture, stretching upward into shadows that the floating torches cannot quite penetrate and extending outward in every direction like a dragon's hoard reimagined as a Victorian attic. You walk forward, and the narrow pathways between towering piles of forgotten belongings create a maze that seems designed by someone with very strong opinions about chaos theory and no interest whatsoever in fire safety regulations. Stacked before you are centuries of accumulated objects, broken vanity mirrors reflecting fragments of torchlight into your eyes, bird cages whose former occupants have long since flown to whatever afterlife awaits magical creatures, piles of books whose pages have yellowed to the color of old parchment and whose contents range from the mundane to the genuinely dangerous. This vast accumulation echoes the real historical phenomenon of cabinets of curiosities, or Wunderkammern, which became popular among European nobility during the Renaissance as private collections of unusual objects, a practice that represented early attempts to categorize and understand the world before the development of modern museums and scientific institutions. You pause beside a teetering stack of cauldrons, some still bearing the residue of potions brewed perhaps 100 years ago, and you consider how many students before you must have walked these same pathways, searching for something specific or merely exploring the archaeological layers of a school's accumulated history. There remains considerable scholarly debate about whether the Room of Hidden Things represents a fixed manifestation of the Room of Requirement, or whether it somehow grows organically as more objects are added, expanding its impossible dimensions to accommodate whatever secrets the castle's inhabitants wish to lose. You step carefully around a pile of chipped gargoyle heads, and I must say, if the gargoyles of Hogwarts could see where their broken faces ended up, they would probably be somewhat offended, which is a sentence I never expected to think, but which feels appropriate to this strange space. The torchlight catches the edge of something metallic ahead, and you recognize the curved surface of a vanishing cabinet, that particular magical artifact which will become so crucially important later in this tale, standing innocuously among hundreds of other discarded objects, as if it were merely another piece of unwanted furniture rather than a potential bridge between worlds. Here is a quirky historical note that academic historians have largely ignored, but which circulates among collectors of unusual medieval trivia. Certain Scottish castles are said to contain oubliettes, with false floors that opened onto secondary hidden chambers, creating layered secrets within secrets. And some folklorists have suggested these architectural features inspired later literary depictions of rooms that contained more than they should. You continue walking, and the air around you carries the musty, complex scent of old magic and older objects, that particular smell which is equal parts ancient dust, forgotten enchantments, and the faint metallic tang of artifacts that really should not have been stored next to each other for so many centuries. A winged catapult catches your eye, inexplicably covered in jeweled barnacles, and you make a mental note that this particular item should probably remain in the Room of Hidden Things forever, given that its purpose appears to be nothing good. The pathway curves now, leading you deeper into this labyrinth of lost things, and you notice that the objects become progressively older the further you travel, as though you are walking backward through time itself. Early editions of textbooks giving way to handwritten manuscripts, mass-produced cauldrons replaced by hand-forged vessels bearing runic inscriptions that you cannot read, but which seem to hum with dormant power. You wonder how many of these objects were hidden here by students who intended to return for them someday, but never did. Victims of time, forgetfulness, graduation, or perhaps darker fates that the cheerful corridors of Hogwarts cannot always prevent. The ceiling above you disappears into darkness that seems almost deliberate, as if the room of hidden things prefers not to reveal the full extent of its vertical dimensions, and you feel appropriately small in this vast space, a single person surrounded by the accumulated secrets of a millennium. I should note, with gentle humor, that if you were to attempt a proper inventory of everything contained in this room, you would need approximately 300 years, a very patient house elf, and possibly a therapist to help you process some of the stranger discoveries. But for now, you simply walk and observe and let the weight of all these hidden histories settle around you like a comfortable blanket woven from other people's secrets. Ahead, something glitters with particular intensity, and you feel drawn toward it, even as you sense that some objects in this room are hidden not because their owners wanted to forget them, but because they should never be found again. The room of requirement transforms now in your imagination, shifting from that vast warehouse of forgotten things into something entirely different, a space designed not for hiding objects but for training young witches and wizards in the forbidden arts of defensive magic during the dark reign of Dolores Umbridge. You stand in the headquarters of Dumbledore's army, and the room has provided exactly what was needed. A spacious practice area with wooden floors smooth enough for footwork, cushions stacked along the walls to soften inevitable falls, and shelves lined with books on defensive spells that the official curriculum had deemed unnecessary under the new regime. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The transformation demonstrates something profound about the Room of Requirement's capabilities. It does not merely provide physical space, but seems to understand the emotional and practical needs underlying a request, manifesting not just a practice room, but a sanctuary, complete with that subtle sense of protection which allowed students to learn without fear of discovery. This echoes the very real historical phenomenon of secret schools and hidden academies that emerged during periods of cultural suppression. During the Ottoman occupation of Greece from the 15th to the 19th century, Greeks maintained illegal night schools called secret schools, Kryphoskolia, where language and orthodox religious education continued despite official prohibition, and children learned to recognize danger signals just as the members of Dumbledore's army learned to check the Marauder's map. You move through this imagined space, and you see the faces of students you know from the story, young witches and wizards who chose courage over comfort, who met in secret because they understood that some knowledge is too important to let tyrants control. There remains an open debate among literary scholars about whether the Room of Requirement's ability to provide exactly what Dumbledore's army needed represents a form of magical sentience or simply extremely sophisticated, responsive enchantment, whether the castle itself, in some sense, wanted to help these students resist the injustice being perpetrated within its walls. You notice the mirrors lining one wall, installed so that students could observe their own wand movements. And you recall all those winter evenings when Harry Potter stood before these same mirrors, teaching Patronus charms to classmates who had never imagined they could produce such advanced magic. The room smells slightly of singed fabric. Someone has clearly been practicing reductor curses with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and you smile at this evidence of determined but imperfect effort, which is, after all, what practice is supposed to look like. Here is a quirky and somewhat fringe historical tidbit that connects to this moment. During the English Civil War, secret royalist societies allegedly met in rooms hidden behind rotating fireplaces, using coded knocking sequences to gain entry, and some of these underground networks operated for years without discovery because their members understood that secrecy requires not just hidden spaces, but also absolute trust among those who share them. You watch as, in your imagination, a younger version of Neville Longbottom finally executes a proper disarming spell, his face transforming from frustrated concentration to genuine joy, and you feel the warmth of witnessing someone discover they are more capable than they believed. The cushions along the wall, I should mention with gentle humor, appear to be enchanted to return themselves to neat stacks after particularly vigorous practice sessions, which is considerate magic. but also perhaps slightly passive-aggressive towards students who leave equipment scattered about. Dumbledore's army used this space for months, meeting in secret, while the rest of the school navigated the increasingly oppressive rules of Umbridge's tenure. And you realize that the Room of Requirement was doing more than providing a practice area. It was providing hope, which is itself a kind of magic that no textbook can fully explain. The whistles of spells being cast echo softly in your imagination, and you see Luna Lovegood practicing with her characteristic dreamlike focus, entirely unconcerned with appearing foolish, because Luna has always understood that caring too much about others' opinions is a peculiar waste of energy. The list of Dumbledore's army members hangs near the entrance, that fateful document which would eventually be discovered and would bring consequences upon everyone who signed it. A reminder that even rooms which cannot be mapped or monitored cannot protect against betrayal from within. You breathe slowly now, and you feel the particular kind of warmth that comes from imagining young people choosing to do difficult things for each other, choosing to learn and grow together in defiance of those who would keep them small and afraid. The Room of Requirement, in this configuration, represents perhaps its noblest purpose. Not a place for hiding shameful secrets or storing dangerous objects, but a sanctuary where the next generation could prepare to face dangers that the adult world seemed unable or unwilling to address. Somewhere outside these walls, in the corridors of imagined Hogwarts, Umbridge continues her reign of small cruelties and official dishonesty. But here, in this room that appears only when needed, something more important is happening. Children are learning to believe in themselves. And that, you realize as you settle deeper into your own blankets, is perhaps the most powerful magic of all, though certainly not the kind that would appear on any OWL examination. The room transforms again in your imagination, and this time the shift carries a darker weight. You find yourself observing the same space through different eyes, seeing not a sanctuary for the brave but a mechanism for betrayal, as Draco Malfoy works in secret to repair the vanishing cabinet that will ultimately allow Death Eaters to breach Hogwarts' defenses. The room has provided exactly what Draco needed. A hidden workshop where he can labor unseen, surrounded by the piled debris of the Room of Hidden Things, his pale face illuminated by wand light as he studies the paired cabinet that his mission requires him to restore to function. You feel the shift in atmosphere immediately, where Dumbledore's army trained in warm camaraderie. Draco works in cold isolation, carrying a burden that is slowly crushing him, because he is a teenager asked to accomplish what adult Death Eaters could not, and failure means not detention but death for himself and for his family. The vanishing cabinet before him operates on principles that connect to the very real historical concept of paired magical objects. During the medieval period, certain alchemists claimed to have created sympathetic devices that could transmit effects across distances. And while mainstream historians dismiss these claims as fraud or misunderstanding, the persistence of such beliefs across centuries suggests something in the human psyche deeply desires objects that transcend the limitations of physical space. Draco's hands shake slightly as he works, a detail that humanizes him even as he labors towards something terrible. And you notice the dark circles under his eyes, the hollowed quality of his features that reveals how little he has been sleeping while maintaining his dual life as student and would-be assassin. There remains significant scholarly debate about the ethics of Draco's choices during this period, whether he should be held fully responsible for actions taken under existential threat to his family, or whether the coercion under which he operated mitigates his moral culpability. A question that echoes broader philosophical discussions about agency and constraint. The cabinet itself is a beautiful object despite its sinister purpose, carved from dark wood with intricate designs that speak to craftsmanship from an earlier era, and you wonder who originally created such a thing and whether they understood the uses to which it might eventually be put. Probably not, since inventors rarely imagine the worst applications of their creations, which is why we have both nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. Here's a peculiar historical note that seems to resonate with this moment. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies experimented with creating communication devices disguised as ordinary furniture, including hollow cabinets with hidden radio transmitters and declassified documents, suggest that some of these devices were installed in embassies for years without detection, proving that the idea of furniture as a mechanism of infiltration has precedent in Muggle history as well. Draco's work progresses slowly across months, with failed attempts and partial successes, and you observe the toll this secret labor takes on a young man who might, in a different world, have simply been an unpleasant but ultimately harmless schoolmate. Someone whose worst crime would be making snide comments about Quidditch rather than facilitating mass murder. The irony is not lost on you. The same room that sheltered students resisting tyranny now shelters a student enabling it, and the room of requirement makes no moral judgments about the needs it fulfills, providing with equal neutrality, a training ground for the brave, and a workshop for the desperate. You watch as Draco sends another bird through the cabinet, one of his many tests, and waits in agonized suspense to learn whether the creature survived the transit or arrived at the other end as a corpse, each dead bird representing both a failed experiment and perhaps a small death of the boy. Draco might have been in better circumstances. I should note, with characteristic dark humor, that if the room of requirement had any sense of irony, it might have manifested a helpful instruction manual titled, "How Not to Make Terrible Life Choices." But magical architecture apparently lacks the capacity for moral intervention. Or perhaps the castle understood that some lessons must be learned through consequences rather than convenience. The room around Draco is cluttered with failed attempts and discarded components, and you notice among the debris objects that seem entirely unrelated to his task. Broken dreams of other students piled around the broken dreams of this one. A kind of symmetry that the room itself probably did not intend, but which feels appropriate nonetheless. The connection between the paired cabinets represents ancient magic, the kind of enchantment that requires not just skill, but also desperation to complete. And Draco's desperation has become profound enough to fuel workings that might otherwise have been impossible for someone of his age and experience. Somewhere above, in the castle's regular corridors, life continues as normal. Students complaining about homework, teachers assigning essays, house elves preparing meals, and none of them know that in this hidden space, the groundwork for catastrophe is being carefully, painfully laid. You breathe slowly as you observe this darker chapter of the room's history, and you recognize that understanding a place fully means understanding its shadows as well as its light. The flames leap and roar in your imagination now as you witness the most destructive moment in the Room of Requirement's long history. Fiendfire, that cursed conflagration beyond ordinary fire, consuming the Room of Hidden Things and everything within it, including the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw that had hidden there for decades, harboring a fragment of Voldemort's splintered soul. You are present in this moment of terrible chaos, observing from the safety of imagination as flames shaped like serpents and chimeras race through the labyrinthine pathways between piled treasures, devouring centuries of accumulated secrets with the appetite of magic that has been specifically designed to be uncontrollable. The heat is overwhelming even in imagination, and you watch as objects that survived for hundreds of years are reduced to ash in seconds. Books whose knowledge is now lost forever, artifacts whose histories will never be told, the accumulated material memory of 1,000 years of magical education vanishing in flames that burn in colors no natural fire could produce. This destruction echoes one of the most tragic events in real-world historical scholarship, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which occurred through various incidents between roughly 48 BCE and the 7th century CE. Destroying countless ancient texts and representing an incalculable loss to human knowledge that scholars have mourned for centuries. And you feel that same sense of mourning now, watching the Room of Hidden Things burn. Vincent Crabbe, who cast the fiendfire he could not control, represents a particular kind of tragedy, someone whose loyalty to a hateful cause led him to unleash forces beyond his comprehension and who paid for that miscalculation with his life, falling into flames of his own creation while his former allies escaped on broomsticks without him. There remains an open scholarly debate about whether the Room of Requirement itself was destroyed by the fiendfire, or whether only this particular manifestation was consumed, whether the room's magic could regenerate itself in time, or whether something essential was lost in the burning that could never be recovered. You watch Harry Potter reaching for the diadem even as the fire approaches, his seeker's reflexes allowing him to snatch the Horcrux from the flames, and you marvel at the particular courage required to reach into an inferno for an object you know to be evil because the evil must be destroyed, and this is the only way. Here is a quirky historical tidbit that academic historians generally overlook, but which seems relevant. Certain medieval texts describe holy fires that allegedly burned only impure objects while leaving sacred items unharmed, and while modern historians dismiss these accounts as religious propaganda, the concept of discriminating flame appears across multiple cultural traditions, suggesting a deep human intuition that some fires might possess intent. The fiend fire, unlike those legendary discriminating flames, destroys everything in its path. The pure and impure alike, the precious and the worthless, the hidden and the forgotten, and you sense in this indiscriminate destruction a kind of metaphor for war itself, which rarely distinguishes between the guilty and the innocent in its appetite for consumption. I should note, with characteristic dark humor, that the Room of Hidden Things probably contained at least several hundred items that absolutely should have been burned centuries ago, so the fiend fire accomplished some good even as it destroyed irreplaceable treasures. A glass half-full perspective that helps slightly with the morning. The ceiling above the flames has disappeared into smoke and fire glow, and you watch the towers of accumulated objects collapsing like the ruins of ancient civilizations, each crash sending up showers of sparks that twist into momentary shapes before dissipating. Ron and Hermione struggle on broomsticks through the chaos, rescuing Draco and Goyle despite every reason to leave them to their fate, and you are reminded that heroism sometimes means saving people who would not have saved you, a definition that makes the act more meaningful, not less. The diadem is damaged now, its ancient enchantments cracking under exposure to the one force capable of destroying Horcruxes, and you feel the fragment of Voldemort's soul within it beginning to die, screaming perhaps, though you cannot hear it over the roar of flames. This moment represents both destruction and liberation, the end of a hiding place and the beginning of Voldemort's ultimate vulnerability. And you hold both truths simultaneously as the fire continues its terrible work. The Room of Hidden Things, that vast warehouse of centuries, is being reduced to ash and memory, and you wonder what future students will find if they ever walk 3 times past this wall again. Whether the room can provide what was lost, or whether some destructions are permanent even for magical architecture. You breathe slowly, watching the fire rage in your imagination, and you feel the particular sadness that accompanies witnessing the loss of things that can never be recovered, even when that loss was necessary for something more important to survive. You step back now from the fire and the chaos, from the dramatic moments that define the Room of Requirement in collective memory, and you turn your attention to a more subtle mystery, the limitations that govern this apparently limitless space, the rules that constrain even the most generous magical architecture. The room cannot provide food, a limitation that seems almost spiteful until you recall Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration, which establishes that food cannot be created from nothing, only summoned, multiplied, or transformed from existing ingredients, and you realize that even the Room of Requirement must operate within broader magical principles rather than transcending them entirely. This constraint connects to very real historical debates about the laws of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy, principles established primarily in the 19th century through the work of scientists like Rudolf Clausius and William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, who demonstrated that energy cannot be created or destroyed but only transformed, a limitation that apparently applies to magic as well as physics. The room also cannot provide accurate information about people who are not present. Hermione's attempts to use the room to locate hidden Horcruxes prove fruitless, suggesting that the room's power operates in physical space rather than informational space, manifesting objects and environments rather than knowledge or intelligence. You settle deeper into your blankets as you consider these limitations, and you find them strangely comforting rather than disappointing, because a room that could do literally anything would be less interesting than a room that can do almost anything within certain mysterious constraints. There remains significant scholarly debate about whether the room's limitations are inherent to its enchantment or represent deliberate choices by the founders, whether they could not make the room provide food or chose not to. Perhaps understanding that unlimited provision would create dependency rather than capability. The Room of Requirement also appears unable to provide passage out of Hogwarts under normal circumstances, though the tunnel to the Hog's Head that appears during the final battle seems to suggest that extreme need might expand the room's capabilities beyond their normal parameters. Or perhaps that particular passage always existed, and the room simply revealed it rather than created it. A distinction that matters to theorists, if not to those fleeing danger. Here is a peculiar historical footnote that seems relevant. Certain medieval alchemists believed that the Philosopher's Stone had limitations despite its legendary powers, and surviving texts suggest heated debates about whether the stone could transform any base metal into gold or only certain specific metals, proving that even imagined omnipotence tends to develop qualifying exceptions once people think about it carefully enough. I should mention, with gentle humor, that the room's inability to provide food is probably for the best, because if students could summon unlimited snacks simply by walking past a wall 3 times, the academic performance at Hogwarts would decline precipitously, while the need for larger uniforms would increase correspondingly. The founders, if they made this limitation deliberately, may have been thinking ahead. The room also cannot replicate certain deeply magical objects. You cannot ask it for another Philosopher's Stone or a functional time turner, suggesting that objects whose creation requires specific extraordinary processes cannot be manifested through need alone, no matter how sincere. This limitation protects against the inflation of magical artifacts that would occur if anyone with strong enough need could simply wish legendary objects into existence. And you appreciate the wisdom of boundaries even as you understand the disappointment they might cause to someone desperately needing exactly the impossible thing the room cannot provide. The Room of Requirement appears on the Marauder's map only sometimes, in certain configurations, which raises questions about the room's relationship to Hogwarts' overall spatial architecture. Whether it exists within the castle's normal dimensions or accesses some adjacent pocket of space that the map's enchantments cannot consistently detect. You find yourself relaxing into these mysteries rather than struggling against them, accepting that some questions about magical architecture may never be fully answered, and that the unknown spaces in our understanding are part of what makes wondering worthwhile. The rules governing the Room of Requirement are not arbitrary, but seem to follow an internal logic that the room's users can learn through experience, like the grammar of a language that no one has ever written down, but which native speakers understand intuitively. You breathe slowly, and you feel the gentle weight of these limitations settling into your understanding, not as frustrations, but as the architecture of wonder. Because a room that could do anything would be less magical somehow than a room that can do remarkable things within the boundaries of its ancient, carefully designed enchantments. You find yourself now in a contemplative space, moving beyond the events that occurred within the Room of Requirement to examine the deeper questions that scholars and enthusiasts have debated for years. The theoretical mysteries that make this magical chamber endlessly fascinating to those who enjoy thinking carefully about fictional worlds. The fundamental question remains unresolved despite decades of analysis. What is the Room of Requirement actually doing when it manifests its various configurations? And where do the objects and spaces come from that appear when someone walks 3 times past the appropriate wall? Some theorists argue for what might be called the generation hypothesis, that the room creates its contents from pure magic, transforming the energy of need into physical reality through enchantments so sophisticated they border on true creation. Others prefer the retrieval hypothesis, suggesting that the room accesses existing objects and spaces from elsewhere, summoning furniture and equipment from storerooms or parallel dimensions rather than making them new. The distinction matters for understanding the true nature of magical architecture. though it has proven impossible to resolve through available evidence. And scholars who study the intersection of magical theory and metaphysics remain divided on which interpretation better explains the observed phenomena. This debate echoes genuine historical arguments in philosophy about the nature of creativity and whether human artists truly create new things or merely recombine existing elements in novel configurations, a question that philosophers from Aristotle through Kant to contemporary theorists have wrestled with without reaching definitive consensus. You consider the implications of each possibility, and you find that both seem equally wondrous in different ways. A room that creates is performing miracles of manifestation, while a room that retrieves is navigating impossibly complex networks of connection across space and perhaps time. Here is a peculiar and somewhat fringe historical tidbit that connects to these theoretical questions. Certain Renaissance occultists believed that material reality was merely a surface layer over deeper spiritual dimensions, and that skilled practitioners could reach through that surface to retrieve objects from the imaginal realm. A concept that mainstream historians dismiss as mystical nonsense, but which provides an interesting metaphor for how the room of requirement might function. The room's apparent sentience, if it can be called that, raises additional questions about consciousness and magical architecture, because the room seems to understand not just explicit requests but underlying needs, providing what people require rather than merely what they ask for, which suggests some capacity for interpretation and perhaps even judgment. I should note, with characteristic gentle humor, that if the room of requirement does possess consciousness, it has been remarkably patient with users who walk past it thinking about contradictory things like, "I need to study," while actually wanting, "I need to nap." The room's ability to interpret sincere need rather than surface thought is really quite sophisticated and should probably be more appreciated. The question of whether the room existed before Hogwarts itself adds another layer of complexity, since some theorists suggest that the founders built the castle around an existing magical anomaly, rather than creating the room through their own enchantments, which would make the room of requirement older than the institution it serves, and potentially older than human magical civilization itself. This possibility connects to broader questions about magical geography, whether certain locations possess inherent supernatural properties that make them suitable for magical construction, a concept that appears in many real-world spiritual traditions, and which may have more literal truth in the wizarding world than in ours. You breathe slowly as you contemplate these layered mysteries, and you feel the pleasure of questions that expand rather than contract as you think about them more carefully. The room of requirement also raises interesting questions about the nature of need itself, whether need is an objective state that the room detects or a subjective experience that the user projects, and whether there are degrees of need that the room responds to differently, providing more elaborate manifestations for more desperate requirements. The room's response to Dumbledore's army versus its response to Draco Malfoy seems to support the idea that the room operates without moral judgment, providing equally for those seeking to resist evil and those seeking to enable it, which raises uncomfortable questions about whether magical architecture should be neutral or whether the founders made an ethical error in not building certain limits into the room's responsiveness. You settle deeper into your blankets, and you realize that these questions are not flaws in the world building, but rather features of it. The mysteries are part of what makes the room of requirement endlessly interesting, because a place that could be fully explained would be a place that had lost some of its magic. The scholarly debates will continue, no doubt, as long as people find pleasure in thinking carefully about imaginary places, and you feel fortunate to participate in that tradition of wondering, even if the questions you raise tonight will never be definitively answered. The room of requirement grows quiet now in your imagination, the dramatic events of its history fading into stillness like ripples settling on a lake after a stone has been thrown and finally absorbed. You stand in the 7th floor corridor one last time, the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy barely visible in the dim light of torches that have burned low during these long hours of exploration, and the blank wall that hides such wonders appears now exactly as it appears to those who have never walked past it 3 times with genuine need. Merely stone, merely ancient, merely part of a castle that has sheltered young witches and wizards for 1,000 years. The silence here is profound and comfortable, the kind of silence that comes after stories have been told and questions have been raised, and the only thing remaining is the gentle descent toward sleep. The castle settles around you in small sounds, the distant creak of a staircase adjusting its position, the soft flutter of an owl returning to the owlery, the almost imperceptible hum of magic that permeates every stone and corridor and hidden chamber of this place that has witnessed so much. You realize, in this quiet moment, that the Room of Requirement represents something more than clever architecture or ancient enchantment. It represents the enduring truth that help appears when we need it most, sometimes from sources we never expected, in forms we did not know to request. Much like the medieval monastery libraries that preserved classical knowledge through the long centuries of the Dark Ages, allowing ancient wisdom to survive until humanity was ready to rediscover it. The Room of Requirement preserves the fundamental magic of hope, the assurance that somewhere, hidden but accessible, there exists a door that will open when our need is real enough. Your breathing slows now, matching the rhythm of the castle's ancient heartbeat, and you feel the weight of the day's thoughts beginning to lift from your shoulders like morning mist rising from the lake. The torches dim further, their flames sinking toward ember glow, and the corridor fills with soft shadows that seem welcoming rather than ominous. Somewhere within the walls of Hogwarts, the Room of Requirement waits in patient potential, neither manifest nor absent, but existing in that liminal space between need and fulfillment, ready to become whatever the next person to walk this corridor truly requires. And you, wrapped in blankets that are themselves a kind of room of requirement for the tired body, feel your thoughts beginning to blur at the edges like watercolors in gentle rain. The stories of the room settle into your memory alongside the comfortable awareness that mysteries remain unsolved, questions unanswered, wonders unexplained. And this is perfectly acceptable, because the world would be smaller if everything could be understood, and sleep comes more sweetly when the mind has been given beautiful things to hold. Your eyes grow heavy now, the weight of wondering pressing them closed with the gentleness of a blessing, and the last thing you see before sleep claims you is that blank stretch of wall, patient and ancient and full of infinite possibility, waiting for someone who needs it enough to call it into being. Rest now. The Room of Requirement will be there in the morning, in stories, in imagination, in all the hidden